The galaxy was in ruins, a fragmented nightmare of forgotten civilizations and decaying star empires. Humanity, once a force that spanned the stars, had fallen into an age of isolation and barbarism. Warp storms choked the void, severing planets from one another. Worlds that had once thrived now languished in darkness, beset by warlords, Xenos predators, and worse, the creeping taint of chaos. It was an era known as the Age of Strife, a time when humanity's destiny seemed lost. Yet, amidst the ashes of this fractured galaxy, there was one man who saw the future with crystal clarity. He was no ordinary man, of course. He was the Emperor of mankind, a being whose origins were shrouded in mystery and myth. He was not a god, at least not in his own mind, but he was something far beyond mortal comprehension. For thousands of years, he had walked among humanity, guiding its progress from the shadows. But now, at the dawn of the 30th millennium, the Emperor knew it was time to step into the light and lead humanity to its ultimate destiny. His vision was monumental in scope. He would reunite the scattered fragments of humanity under a single banner, the Imperium of Man. He would forge a galaxy-spanning empire that would stand for all eternity, unyielding in its defiance of the horrors lurking beyond the stars. But to achieve this, the Emperor needed an army unlike any other. He needed warriors who could conquer entire worlds in his name. He needed leaders who could inspire and command legions of soldiers. He needed sons. The creation of the Primarchs began in secret, deep beneath the surface of Terra. The Emperor gathered his most trusted gene smiths and set to work on a project that would shape the fate of the galaxy. He would create the Primarchs, 20 superhuman beings, each one genetically engineered from his own DNA. They would be more than men. They would be gods of war, imbued with the Emperor's strength, intelligence, and charisma. Each Primarch would be designed to embody a particular aspect of war and leadership, ensuring that no challenge would be beyond their reach. The process was meticulous. The Emperor poured his knowledge of genetics, bioengineering, and the arcane sciences into their creation. Each Primarch grew within a gestation capsule, their development carefully monitored to ensure perfection. These were not mindless constructs. They were intended to be fully sentient, self-aware beings with personalities, ambitions, and free will. In many ways, they were reflections of the Emperor himself, though each would manifest different aspects of his character. But then, disaster struck. The ruinous powers of chaos, the dark gods that dwelled within the Imperium, had been watching the Emperor's work with growing alarm. They understood the threat he posed to their dominion. A united humanity, led by the Emperor and his Primarchs, would be a force strong enough to resist the temptations of chaos. It could even expunge their influence from the galaxy entirely. The Chaos Gods could not allow this to happen. With malice and cunning, they struck. Warp energy surged through the Emperor's laboratories, and in an instant, the gestation capsules were scattered across the galaxy. Each Primarch was cast into the void, hurtling through the warp to an unknown fate. The Emperor's greatest creations were lost before they could even take their first steps. For a brief moment, despair threatened to take hold of the Emperor. His grand plan had been shattered. The Primarchs were the keystones of his vision, and now they were gone. But the Emperor was not one to wallow in defeat. He was a being of supreme willpower, and and he knew that the galaxy's fate rested on his shoulders. He would not give up. The Emperor turned his attention to the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marine legions. Using genetic material derived from the Primarchs' original DNA, he created 20 legions of superhuman warriors. These legions would serve as the vanguard of his campaign to reunite humanity. Each legion bore distinct traits inherited from their lost Primarch, though at this stage they were incomplete reflections of their progenitors. With his legions at his command, the Emperor launched the Great Crusade, a military campaign of unprecedented scale. His fleets of warships cut through the void, liberating human worlds that had long been isolated by warp storms. Planets that had fallen into barbarism were brought back into the fold of civilization. Warlords and tyrants were overthrown. On every world he conquered, the Emperor spread his message of unity, reason, and enlightenment, though those who resisted quickly learned that his patience was limited. It wasn't just a war for territory. The Great Crusade was a war for humanity's very soul. The Emperor sought to stamp out the old superstitions and primitive religions that had taken root during the Age of Strife. He preached a doctrine of imperial truth. There were no gods, no demons, no afterlife. There was only science, reason, and the natural order of the universe. To the Emperor, the gods of chaos were nothing more than parasites, feeding on humanity's fears and ignorance. He intended to deny them their sustenance by bringing humanity into an age of enlightenment. But while the Emperor's forces spread across the galaxy, he never lost sight of his true goal, the rediscovery of the Primarchs. He knew they were still out there, scattered across countless worlds. Each Primarch was a potential game changer, a leader who could turn the tide of any campaign, a being capable of inspiring millions to follow him. The Emperor was determined to find them, no matter the cost. One by one, the Primarchs were found. As the Emperor's fleets pushed further into the galaxy, they encountered worlds that were ruled by beings of immense power and charisma, worlds that had flourished despite the hardships of the Age of Strife. These were the worlds of the Primarchs, though each one bore the scars of its own unique history. On Shagoris, they found Khan, a warlord who had united the nomadic tribes of his planet through a combination of martial prowess and cunning strategy. On Nocturne, they found Vulcan, a giant of a man who had become a protector and leader of his people. On Olympia, they found Perturabo, an architect and siege master who had shaped his world with iron discipline. Some Primarchs welcomed the Emperor with open arms. Robuta Gilliman, found on the world of Macragge, immediately recognized the Emperor as the leader he had been waiting for. Others, like Leman Russ of Fenris, required a more direct show of strength before they would submit. And then there were those whose worlds had been shaped by darkness, such as Angron, who the Emperor found enslaved and brutalized, leading a doomed rebellion against his masters. Each reunion brought its own challenges, but with every Primarch found, the Emperor's vision grew closer to reality. He didn't just want them as generals, he wanted them as sons. The Emperor believed that they would share in his dream of a unified, enlightened humanity. He believed that they would carry his ideals forward long after he was gone. But the Emperor, for all his wisdom, failed to see one critical truth. The Primarchs were not mere extensions of his will. They were individuals with their own thoughts, ambitions, and flaws. Some would become his greatest allies. Others would become his most bitter enemies. And the seeds of that tragedy were already being sown. The galaxy burned with the light of 100,000 war zones. Planet after planet fell under the banners of the Legiones Astartes, their conquests relentless, their loyalty to the Emperor unwavering. With every battle won, the dream of a unified Imperium drew closer to reality. The Emperor himself often walked among his warriors, leading them into battle, his presence a beacon of strength that inspired mortal soldiers and transhuman warriors alike. It was a time of glory, of triumph, but also of unseen cracks beginning to form. The turning point came at the triumph of Ulanor. This was no ordinary campaign. Ulanor had been a nightmare. The orc warlord Urlak Urg ruled an empire of unimaginable size, commanding hordes of greenskins that stretched across entire sectors. His Wa had crushed dozens of human civilizations, reducing once prosperous worlds to smoking ruins. Left unchecked, his forces could have overwhelmed the entire region, creating a power vacuum that would draw in even more enemies. The Emperor, however, did not intend to leave Ulanor unchecked. He gathered the full might of the Imperial war machine, a crusade force so vast that even the orcs, with their endless swarms, could not match it. Every Space Marine Legion took part, each one led by their Primarch. Battle fleets darkened the skies, their guns pounding the orc fortresses with unrelenting fire. Titans of the Mechanicum walked the surface, leveling entire cities with their god machines. It was the most spectacular display of Imperial power the galaxy had ever seen. At the heart of it all was Horus Lupercal, the Primarch of the Luna Wolves. Unlike his more aloof brothers, Horus had a natural charisma that endeared him to those under his command. He was warm, approachable, at least by the standards of a transhuman demigod. He treated his warriors like brothers in arms rather than mere tools of war. His presence on the battlefield was undeniable, a towering figure clad in ornate power armor adorned with wolf motifs, his piercing gaze capable of cutting through the fog of war. At Ulanor, Horus was everywhere. He led boarding actions against orc warships, personally slew Urlak Urg's war bosses, and stood at the front lines when the final fortress fell. He earned the loyalty of his men not through fear or distant authority, but by standing alongside them, shedding blood with them. To the Luna Wolves, Horus wasn't just a Primarch. He was their war master, their guiding star, and the Emperor noticed. After Urlak Urg was finally slain and Ulanor secured, the Emperor declared a grand celebration, the triumph of Ulanor. It was a spectacle of unmatched grandeur. The Luna Wolves, newly victorious, stood proudly at the forefront. The other legions, Iron Hands, Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and more, gathered to witness this historic moment. Statues of the Emperor and his Primarchs were raised, banners unfurled, and the sky was filled with the roar of cheering crowds. It was during this ceremony that the Emperor made his fateful decision. He stood before his sons, his expression impassive, but his words filled with purpose. "Horus, my son, you shall be my war master." The title sent shockwaves through the gathered legions. The War Master would be the supreme commander of the Great Crusade, second only to the Emperor himself. It was a role that carried immense responsibility and immense power. For Horus, it was the ultimate honor, but for others, it planted the first seeds of jealousy and resentment. Some of the Primarchs accepted the decision with grace. Robut Guilliman of the Ultramarines, ever pragmatic, saw the wisdom in appointing a single leader to oversee the crusade. Others, however, were less accepting. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors simmered with bitterness, convinced that his own tactical genius had been overlooked. Angron, ever the broken warrior, cared little for titles, but resented the authority being placed over him. Even Lorgar, the zealous spiritual leader of the Word-Bearers, viewed the appointment with a tinge of jealousy. But Horus himself, he took to the role with confidence, and perhaps, in hindsight, a touch of hubris. Shortly after the triumph of Ulanor, the Emperor made another monumental decision. He would return to Terra. The Great Crusade was far from over, but the Emperor's priorities had shifted. He had a new project, one he believed would secure humanity's future forever. The Webway Project. This was no ordinary undertaking. The Emperor intended to create a stable, human-controlled pathway through the warp, bypassing the need for risky warp travel and shielding humanity from the influence of chaos. To achieve this, he needed to build a gate into the Webway, the ancient labyrinthine network of tunnels used by the Eldar. It was a task of unimaginable complexity, requiring his full attention. And so, the Emperor left the crusade in Horus's hands. At first, the legions accepted this transition without issue. The Emperor's word was law, but as the years passed, the absence of the Emperor began to weigh heavily on his sons. Some Primarchs, like Guilliman, focused on their duties. Others, like Lorgar, began to question why their father had seemingly abandoned them. And Horus, he carried the weight of the crusade alone. With the Emperor gone, Horus began to assert his authority over the legions. At first, his leadership was universally respected. He was a brilliant tactician, a charismatic leader, and a diplomat capable of navigating the complex personalities of his brothers. But leadership brought new challenges. Horus began to forge alliances with certain Primarchs, building a core group of supporters. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, drawn to Horus's charm and ambition, became one of his closest allies. Mortarion of the Death Guard, grim and pragmatic, respected Horus's strategic mind. Even Angron, brutal and unstable, found a certain kinship with Horus's willingness to use any means necessary to achieve victory. At the same time, cracks began to appear in his relationships with others. Rogel Dorn, ever the dutiful son, grew wary of Horus's growing influence. Leman Russ, fiercely independent, resented any attempt to control him. And then there was Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels. He loved Horus like a brother, but he sensed something, some shadow, creeping into Horus's soul. Still, Horus pressed on. His loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, or so it seemed. He fought with unmatched ferocity, bringing world after world into compliance. He crushed rebellions, defeated Xenos empires, and spread the Imperial truth wherever he went. He was just unstoppable. The War Master's conquests had become the stuff of legend. World after world fell to his armies. Some saw the Luna Wolves as liberators, while others cursed them as conquerors. But the result was always the same. The Imperium expanded. The Great Crusade surged ever forward, and Horus's reputation grew with every victory. Yet for all his triumphs, the burden of leadership weighed heavily on him. The Emperor was gone, sequestered on Terra with his secretive Webway project. The other Primarchs, each with their own personalities and ambitions, weren't always easy to control. Some chafed under Horus's authority, others questioned his decisions, and through it all, the War Master began to feel something unfamiliar, a gnawing doubt. It wasn't that Horus doubted his own abilities. He knew he was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and the Emperor's chosen son. But the weight of the Imperium's future sat squarely on his shoulders, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been left to carry this burden alone. And then came Davin. Davin was a world of little strategic value, orbiting a bloated gas giant in the Sabathian system. It was a backwater planet, populated by feudal tribes and ruled by a petty warlord named Yugen Temba, who had once been a loyal servant of the Imperium. Temba had been placed in power by the Luna Wolves themselves, tasked with overseeing Davin after its compliance was achieved. But now, something had changed. Reports reached Horus that Temba had turned against the Imperium. His once loyal warriors now followed him in rebellion, and he had fortified himself in an ancient temple complex deep within the planet's swamps. The War Master was furious. He had placed his trust in Temba, and the betrayal stung deeply. This wasn't just another rebellious warlord, it was personal. Horus ordered his fleet to make for Davin immediately. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, spearheaded by the Luna Wolves, descended upon the planet with their usual precision. The skies over Davin were dark with Imperial warships, their guns trained on the surface below. Drop pods thundered down, bringing the Emperor's vengeance to those who had dared defy his will. But something was off. The swampy landscape of Davin was unnervingly quiet. The air was thick with humidity and buzzing insects, the smell of rot permeating everything. The temple complex where Temba had fortified himself wasn't the crude structure of a tribal chieftain. It was ancient, covered in strange glyphs and symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Still, Horus pressed forward. He would not tolerate betrayal, especially not from someone he had once trusted. Horus personally led the assault on Temba's fortress. He didn't wait in orbit, directing his forces from a command ship like some distant general. That wasn't his way. He was a warrior first and foremost, and he believed in leading from the front. The battle was brutal. Temba's warriors fought with fanatical ferocity, far beyond what Horus had expected from a simple planetary rebellion. They seemed possessed by an unnatural rage, throwing themselves at the Luna Wolves with reckless abandon. The fortress itself was shrouded in a strange, unnatural mist, making it difficult for the Space Marines to coordinate their assault. Then came the moment that would change everything. Horus confronted Yugen Temba in the temple's central chamber, but Temba was no longer the man he had once been. His body was bloated and grotesque, his skin stretched tight over bulging muscles and unnatural growths. His eyes glowed with a sickly light, and his voice echoed with the whispers of something ancient and malevolent. In his hands, Temba wielded a massive, corrupted mace, a weapon unlike anything Horus had ever seen. It pulsed with dark energy, radiating a palpable aura of malice. Temba raised the weapon and struck. The blow was catastrophic. Horus was grievously wounded, the corrupted weapon tearing through his armor and flesh. The War Master, the greatest of the Emperor's sons, fell to his knees. His blood soaked the temple floor, mingling with the foul ichor that dripped from Temba's weapon. The Luna Wolves fought desperately to pull their Primarch to safety, but the damage had been done. For the first time in his life, Horus was mortally wounded. The Luna Wolves' apothecaries worked frantically to save their Gene Father, but the wound was unlike anything they had ever encountered. No amount of medical expertise or advanced technology could halt the spread of the corruption that had entered Horus's body. As the situation grew more desperate, one name kept being whispered among the Davenite locals: the Serpent Lodge. It was an ancient place of power, shrouded in mystery and superstition. The locals claimed that the lodge's rituals could heal any wound, even one as grave as the War Master's. Desperate for a solution, Horus's advisors decided to take him there. The Serpent Lodge was a dark, foreboding structure, carved from black stone and adorned with serpentine motifs. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and the flickering light of candles. Strange symbols covered the walls, and hooded figures moved in the shadows, their faces hidden beneath ceremonial masks. Horus was laid on an altar of cold stone, his body racked with pain. The lodge's high priest, a figure known only as Erebus, stepped forward to perform the ritual. What happened next is one of the most pivotal and controversial moments in the history of the Imperium. As the ritual began, Horus's mind was cast into the warp. There, he was confronted by the Chaos Gods themselves. They showed him visions of the future, a future where the Emperor ruled as a tyrant, abandoning his sons and humanity to endless suffering. They whispered promises of power, freedom, and the chance to reshape the galaxy in his own image. They played on Horus's doubts and fears, the burden of leadership, the sense of abandonment he felt, the jealousy simmering among his brothers. All of it was brought to the surface and magnified. Horus fought against the influence of chaos, but even the mightiest of the Primarchs was not immune to its insidious lure. The Chaos Gods made their offer clear: serve us, and we will give you the power to save humanity from its own destruction. Reject us, and you will die here, forgotten and abandoned. In the end, Horus accepted. When Horus returned to his fleet after the ritual on Davin, the change was subtle but undeniable. He was the same War Master his legions revered, at least outwardly. His orders remained calculated, his strategy flawless. His voice carried the same weight of authority, and his charisma still burned bright. But behind his commanding presence, there was now a darkness simmering just beneath the surface, an unseen force quietly pulling the strings of his ambition. Gone was the son who had once fought to fulfill his father's dream of uniting the galaxy. Now, there was something new, a desire for freedom from the Emperor's authority. He no longer saw himself as the loyal servant, the favored son. The visions shown to him during the ritual on Davin had planted a dangerous seed of rebellion. In Horus's mind, the Emperor was no longer a benevolent father, but a tyrant, a liar who sought to chain humanity to his own will. It was a gradual shift at first. Horus didn't immediately reveal his newfound allegiance to the Chaos Gods. Instead, he moved carefully, testing the loyalty of those around him. He began reaching out to his brothers, gauging which of the Primarchs could be swayed to his cause and which might need to be dealt with. The first to fall in line was Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children. Fulgrim had always been a creature of perfection and excess, obsessed with beauty, art, and the pursuit of greatness. He had long believed that he and his legion were destined to achieve absolute perfection in all things. Horus played on this obsession, telling Fulgrim that the Emperor sought to limit his potential, to keep him and his legion trapped in mediocrity. It wasn't long before Fulgrim fell prey to the whispers of the chaos god Slanesh, embracing the pursuit of perfection in ways that would ultimately lead to his damnation. Then there was Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters. Angron's story was one of tragedy and rage. He had been raised as a gladiator slave on the brutal world of Nuceria, forced to fight in the pits for the amusement of his overlords. When the Emperor found him, Angron was leading a hopeless rebellion, and instead of standing by his side, the Emperor abducted him and left his followers to die. Angron never forgave his father for that betrayal. His rage burned hotter with each passing day, and Horus knew exactly how to stoke that fire. Chaos offered Angron freedom from control, an escape from the chains of duty and expectation. It wasn't long before he and his world eaters gave in to the butcher's nails, the psychosurgical implants that drove them into bloodthirsty madness. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, was a more complicated case. He had always been a grim and stoic figure, shaped by the toxic world of Barbarous, where he had fought against monstrous overlords who thrived in poisonous mists. Mortarion despised weakness and had a deep distrust of anything he perceived as sorcery. But Horus was patient. He knew that Mortarion's greatest fear was powerlessness, the idea that he could not protect his legion or his people from forces beyond his control. When Mortarion's fleet became stranded in the warp, exposed to a horrific plague sent by Nurgle, Horus convinced him that the only way to save his legion was to embrace the plague god. Mortarion's fall was one of reluctant pragmatism, but it was no less complete. By the time Horus had secured the loyalty of Fulgrim, Angron, and Mortarion, the core of the traitor forces was established. But he wasn't done yet. If any of the Primarchs were already deeply aligned with chaos before Horus's fall, it was Lorgar, Primarch of the Word-Bearers. Lorgar's journey to damnation had begun long before Davin. His legion had once been fanatically devoted to the Emperor, viewing him as a divine figure to be worshipped. But the Emperor rejected their worship, insisting that there were no gods and that the Imperium must be founded on reason, science, and secular truth. The Emperor's rebuke of Lorgar was harsh and public. He personally ordered the Ultramarines to burn the Word-Bearers' homeworld of Monarchia, destroying their temples and icons, and forcing Lorgar to kneel in shame before his brothers. The humiliation burned deep into Lorgar's soul. He couldn't accept that the universe was devoid of higher meaning. In his search for divine purpose, he turned to the dark gods of the warp. By the time Horus began gathering his allies, Lorgar and his legion were already deeply entrenched in the worship of chaos. They had been spreading corruption and religious fervor across the Imperium for years, planting the seeds that would soon blossom into full-scale rebellion. Lorgar saw Horus's rise as a fulfillment of prophecy, the coming of a new age where the chaos gods would rule over all. With Lorgar's help, Horus's rebellion spread quickly. The Word-Bearers acted as the heralds of chaos, spreading their corrupt teachings to other legions and worlds. Their priests, the chaplains, became agents of subversion, quietly converting those within the Imperium to the worship of the dark gods. Horus knew that his rebellion couldn't succeed unless he first purged his own legions of loyalists. Not every space marine would follow him into treachery. There were those who remained fiercely loyal to the Emperor, even within the legions that had begun to fall to chaos. The decision to launch the Isstvan III campaign marked the moment when Horus fully committed to his rebellion. There was no more ambiguity, no more shadowy dealings or quiet conversations in dark corners. This was the first act of open betrayal, and it was as ruthless as it was calculated. Horus understood that if he was to succeed in his war against the Emperor, he couldn't afford to have any lingering doubts or divided loyalties within his own ranks. The purge had to begin from within. But Horus, ever the tactician, knew better than to broadcast his intentions. The Isstvan III campaign would be presented as a simple compliance mission, just another step in the Great Crusade. The loyalist commanders within the traitor legions would have no reason to suspect the treachery that awaited them. They were, after all, fighting under the banner of the War Master, the Emperor's chosen son. To them, Horus was still the paragon of loyalty and strength. They couldn't have been more wrong. The target was the planet Isstvan III, a world that had openly rebelled against the Imperium. The rebellion was led by Kirill Sinderman, a former planetary governor who had declared independence from the Emperor's rule. The Isstvan system had long been a hotbed of unrest, and this latest uprising was seen as an opportunity for Horus to test the loyalty of his own legions. Horus ordered a joint deployment from several of the most prominent legions under his command: the Luna Wolves, Emperor's Children, World Eaters, and Death Guard. Thousands of Space Marines were chosen to participate in the assault, drawn from both loyalist and traitor factions within the legions. On the surface, it appeared to be a routine military operation, a standard compliance campaign to bring a rebellious world back into the fold. But the selection process was anything but random. Horus carefully chose those he suspected of remaining loyal to the Emperor. These were the warriors who still clung to the ideals of the Great Crusade, who believed in the Emperor's vision of a united secular galaxy. They were the ones who would never follow Horus into rebellion, and therefore they had to die. Among the loyalists were notable figures such as Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard and Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children. These were men of unwavering loyalty and conviction, seasoned warriors who had fought alongside their Primarchs for decades. They had no idea that the very brothers standing beside them were about to turn against them. Once the loyalist forces were deployed to the planet's surface, Horus made his move. He ordered the use of the Life Eater virus, one of the most horrific weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. The virus was designed to consume all organic matter with terrifying speed, reducing entire populations to sludge and ash within moments. It was a weapon of absolute annihilation. There would be no survivors. The virus bombing began with little warning. The loyalist forces on the ground saw the skies darken as orbital bombardments rained down upon them. They had expected air support, perhaps, or additional reinforcements. Instead, they were greeted with a deathly silence, broken only by the howling winds that carried the virus across the planet. The Life Eater virus spread like wildfire. Plants withered, animals collapsed, and human flesh dissolved into a bubbling liquid mass within seconds. Entire cities were wiped from existence in an instant. Buildings remained intact, their skeletal structures standing as grim monuments to the devastation. But everything living was gone. For most of the Loyalists, there was no time to react. They died in horrifying agony, their bodies liquefied by the virus before they even realized what was happening. The betrayal was absolute, cold, calculated, and merciless. But not everyone perished. Nathaniel Garrow, captain of the Death Guard's 7th Company, was one of the few who survived the initial bombardment. His instincts and quick thinking saved him and a handful of his men from the worst of the virus. As the planet fell into silence around him, Garrow realized the truth. Horus had betrayed them. The War Master's treachery was now undeniable. At the same time, Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children also managed to evade the virus bombing. Tarvitz was a practical and cautious warrior, and when he noticed the unusual behavior of the traitor fleet in orbit, he ordered his men to take cover. His actions saved dozens of Loyalists who would otherwise have been wiped out. Together, Garrow and Tarvitz rallied the surviving Loyalists on Istvan III. They had no illusions about their chances. They were outnumbered and outgunned, stranded on a planet that had become a death trap. But they refused to go down without a fight. The Loyalists fortified their positions and prepared for the inevitable ground assault by the traitor legions. When the virus bombing failed to completely wipe out the Loyalists, Horus ordered the traitor forces to descend to the planet's surface and finish the job. The Loyalists, already battered and demoralized, now faced an even more heartbreaking reality. They would have to fight their own brothers. The assault was brutal and emotionally devastating. Space Marines, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in battle, now found themselves on opposite sides, locked in a desperate struggle for survival. The bonds of brotherhood, forged over decades of war, were torn apart in an instant. For the Loyalists, it was a fight to the death. They knew there would be no reinforcements, no rescue. They fought not for victory, but for honor and defiance. Every inch of ground was contested. Every hallway and barricade turned into a last stand. As the battle raged on, Nathaniel Garrow realized that the Imperium had to be warned. The Emperor needed to know about Horus's betrayal before it was too late. But getting off Istvan III was no small feat. With help from Loyalist survivors, Garrow managed to take control of a damaged frigate, the Eisenstein. The ship was barely spaceworthy, its systems compromised by the virus and the ensuing battle. But Garrow had no choice. He and his crew launched the Eisenstein into the void, knowing that their chances of survival were slim. Their mission was simple: get to Terra, warn the Emperor, expose the War Master's betrayal. What followed was a harrowing journey through the warp, plagued by demonic incursions, mutinies, and relentless pursuit by traitor forces. But Garrow, driven by his unwavering loyalty to the Emperor, refused to give up. His message would change the course of history. The galaxy was on the brink of war, but the full scale of Horus's betrayal had yet to be revealed. The Emperor was still unaware of just how deeply chaos had corrupted his favored son, but those closest to the War Master, those who had pledged themselves to his cause knew that Istvayan III was only the beginning. Horus's next move would be far more devastating. He had laid his trap carefully, drawing in his unsuspecting brothers with the promise of redemption. The loyalist legions sent to Istvahan V believed they were about to strike a decisive blow against rebellion. Instead, they were marching into one of the bloodiest betrayals in human history. When news of the events on Istvahan III reached Terra, the initial reaction was one of disbelief and outrage. The idea that Horus, the Emperor's chosen war master, could turn against the Imperium was almost incomprehensible. The Emperor himself remained silent and focused on his Webway project, delegating the military response to his loyal sons. The loyalist legions were quick to mobilize. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists took command of the defense of Terra, fortifying the Imperial Palace in preparation for what he suspected would be an eventual siege. Meanwhile, 7 loyalist legions were dispatched to Istvahan V, where Horus had begun to fortify his position. The plan seemed simple enough. The loyalists would land on Istvahan V, crush the traitor forces, and bring Horus to justice. But they had no idea that half of the legions marching with them were already aligned with the War Master. The loyalist fleet arrived in the Istvayan system with the full might of the Imperium behind it. Battle barges and strike cruisers hung in orbit, their guns trained on the planet below. The surface of Istvahan V was harsh and unforgiving, a barren wasteland of jagged rocks and black sands. It was a fitting battlefield for what would become one of the darkest days in the history of the Imperium. Leading the loyalist forces were Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, Vulcan of the Salamanders, and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard. These 3 Primarchs had answered the call to bring Horus to justice, each bringing their legions with them. They believed that their mission was clear-cut and righteous, to root out the traitors and restore order to the Imperium. As the drop pods and Thunderhawks descended through the atmosphere, the Loyalists were unaware of the betrayal that awaited them. Horus's forces on the ground, consisting of the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's children, waited patiently, playing the part of Loyalists long enough to ensure that the trap would be sprung at just the right moment. The battle began as expected. The Loyalists made planetfall, establishing a foothold on Istvahan V and engaging what they believed to be enemy forces. For a time, it seemed like the campaign was progressing smoothly. The Loyalist forces pushed forward, driving the traitor forces back toward their fortified positions. Then, the signal came. At a prearranged moment, Horus's true allies revealed their loyalty. The legions that had marched alongside the Loyalists, the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Word Bearers, turned on their former comrades, opening fire on the Loyalist forces from behind. The Loyalists, caught completely off guard, found themselves surrounded on all sides. It was a massacre. The battlefield descended into utter chaos as brother turned against brother. The Loyalists, believing they had come to fight alongside their allies, suddenly realized they were facing annihilation. The carefully laid trap had worked perfectly. Horus's forces had split the Loyalist forces in 2, cutting them off from reinforcements and ensuring that there would be no escape. The skies above Istvahan V were filled with fire and ash as drop pods rained down, carrying more traitor forces to the surface. Titans of the Legio Mortis, corrupted by chaos, stomped across the battlefield, their guns tearing through loyalist formations. The once disciplined ranks of Space Marines crumbled under the weight of the betrayal. At the heart of the loyalist advance was Ferrus Manus, the stoic and unyielding Primarch of the Iron Hands. Ferrus had always been a warrior of unyielding conviction, a master craftsman who believed in the power of technology and the strength of the human will. He had marched to Isstvan V with a burning desire for justice, determined to confront Horus and put an end to his rebellion. But Ferrus was not prepared for what awaited him. During the battle, Ferrus Manus encountered Fulgrim, his once close brother, and the Primarch of the Emperor's children. Their reunion was anything but friendly. Fulgrim, now fully corrupted by the influence of Slaanesh, sought to convert Ferrus to Horus's cause. He believed that he could persuade Ferrus to join the rebellion, to see the Emperor's vision as flawed and doomed to failure. But Ferrus Manus was unyielding. He rejected Fulgrim's offer with cold fury, refusing to betray the Emperor. In that moment, the bond between the two brothers was irrevocably shattered. The two Primarchs clashed in brutal combat, their weapons ringing out across the battlefield. Ferrus wielded Forgebreaker, a mighty warhammer gifted to him by Fulgrim himself, while Fulgrim fought with Fireblade, a sword of exquisite craftsmanship. The duel was fierce and unrelenting, a battle of strength versus elegance. But in the end, it was Fulgrim who emerged victorious. Consumed by his newfound loyalty to Slaanesh and the promise of godhood, Fulgrim struck the killing blow. He severed Ferrus Manus's head with a final, brutal stroke, marking the first Primarch to fall in the Horus Heresy. The death of Ferrus Manus was a devastating blow to the loyalist forces, shattering their morale and leaving them leaderless in the midst of the massacre. With Ferrus Manus dead and the loyalist forces in disarray, the battle quickly became a slaughter. The loyalists were hunted down by their traitor brothers, their resistance crushed beneath the weight of Horus's betrayal. Corvus Corax and Vulcan managed to escape the carnage, retreating with the remnants of their legions to warn the rest of the Imperium. But the damage had been done. The Isstvan 5 drop site massacre was a decisive victory for Horus, eliminating 3 loyalist legions as effective fighting forces and ensuring that his path to Terra was clear. The massacre was a turning point. The galaxy was now fully embroiled in civil war. The Imperium, once the most powerful human empire in the galaxy, was now fractured. Loyalist forces scrambled to regroup, their legions battered and broken, while Horus and his traitorous allies rampaged through the stars, burning everything in their path. From the void above Isstvan, Horus watched as his fleet expanded its warpath. His forces were relentless, and their purpose was clear: the complete destruction of the Emperor's realm. But this wasn't mindless destruction. Horus wasn't just conquering worlds. He was sending a message to the Imperium. His betrayal was no longer a secret, and he wanted every loyalist to know that there would be no mercy. His goal was Terra, the throne of his father, and the heart of the Imperium itself. The road to Terra would be paved with fire, blood, and ash. Horus's forces didn't simply march straight for Terra. That would have been a tactical blunder. The War Master was far too cunning for that. Instead, he ordered his legions to spread out across the galaxy, crippling loyalist strongholds and severing lines of communication between Terra and the remaining loyalist legions. Worlds that had stood for centuries in loyalty to the Emperor now found themselves under siege by their former protectors. The Death Guard, once seen as implacable guardians, now spread disease and decay wherever they went. Entire planetary populations were wiped out by pestilence and plague, their bodies rotting in the streets as Mortarian's fleets moved on to the next target. There was no time to grieve, no time to rebuild. The galaxy was burning. Fulgrim's Emperor's children descended into orgiastic violence, turning compliance campaigns into grisly displays of excess and cruelty. Once known for their pristine armor and meticulous discipline, Fulgrim's legion had become twisted beyond recognition. Their assaults weren't just about conquering planets. They were about reveling in the suffering of their victims. They left behind monuments of flesh and bone, grotesque parodies of the imperial statues that once adorned loyal worlds. Meanwhile, the World Eaters, led by Angron, carved a path of unimaginable carnage. Angron, consumed by the butcher's nails, had abandoned any semblance of tactical restraint. His legion was now nothing more than a horde of berserk killers, driven by uncontrollable rage. Entire cities were reduced to rubble as the World Eaters tore through civilian populations, leaving no survivors. Even the Word-Bearers, under Lorgar, played their part in the campaign of destruction. But where the other traitor legions brought death and devastation, the Word-Bearers brought something far more insidious: corruption of the soul. On every world they conquered, Lorgar's priests established temples to the ruinous powers, converting entire populations to the worship of chaos. These temples became beacons of dark energy, spreading warp corruption across the stars. The loyalist legions, though battered, were far from defeated. Rogel Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, took command of the Imperial defenses. His task was monumental. The Emperor had entrusted him with fortifying Terra itself, turning the Imperial Palace into an unbreakable bastion. Dorn's stone-faced pragmatism and unyielding discipline were exactly what the Imperium needed in this moment of crisis. He understood that the fate of humanity would be decided on Terra, and he was determined to hold the line at all costs. But even as Dorn worked tirelessly to strengthen Terra's defenses, he knew that reinforcements were desperately needed. The Loyalist legions were scattered across the galaxy, many of them still reeling from the betrayal at Isfahan 5. Guilliman's Ultramarines, the largest of the Loyalist legions, were trapped in the eastern fringe, too far from Terra to provide immediate support. The Blood Angels, led by Sanguinius, began their march toward Terra, knowing that their Primarch's fate was intertwined with the Emperor's. Sanguinius, the noble warrior and arguably the strongest of the Primarchs, was plagued by visions of his own death, but he did not waver. His legion was ready to stand at the Emperor's side, no matter the cost. The Dark Angels, led by Lion El Johnson, and the White Scars, led by Jagatai Khan, also began maneuvering toward Terra, though their routes were fraught with treachery and warp storms. Time was running out. Horus's forces were closing in on Terra, and the Loyalist legions knew that the final battle was approaching. While his forces ravaged the galaxy, Horus focused on his ultimate objective, the siege of Terra. He knew that the Imperial Palace was the key to the Emperor's power. If he could break through its defenses and kill the Emperor, the Imperium would crumble. His victory would be complete and absolute. But Horus was no fool. He understood that the assault on Terra would be the most difficult battle of his campaign. The Emperor's defenses would be formidable, and the loyalist legions would fight with the fury of desperation. Horus began to gather his forces. The traitor legions, battle-hardened and bloodthirsty, were ready for the final confrontation. The Titan legions of the Dark Mechanicum, corrupted by chaos, prepared to march alongside the traitor legions. The traitor Primarchs, each consumed by their own twisted ambitions, pledged their allegiance to Horus for one final push. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. Horus knew that if he was to succeed, he would need to confront the Emperor directly. He couldn't simply rely on his armies to breach the palace walls. He would need to lower the Emperor's defenses, lure him out, and strike the killing blow himself. The fate of humanity would be decided by father and son in a confrontation that had been building since the dawn of the Great Crusade. The march to Terra wasn't just a military campaign. It was the beginning of the end for the Imperium of man. Horus understood this better than anyone. He embraced his role as the destroyer, believing that only through destruction could humanity be reborn. And so, the galaxy burned. The Sol system, once the most secure and heavily defended region of the Imperium, now stood on the brink of total annihilation. The War Master Horus, corrupted by the powers of chaos and driven by a relentless ambition to overthrow his father, had finally arrived at the threshold of Terra. The Great Crusade, the Emperor's grand vision to unite humanity under one banner, had led to this moment, a cataclysmic showdown that would decide the fate of the galaxy. Horus's fleet emerged from the warp like a storm of nightmares, spilling forth ships corrupted by dark energies and warped beyond recognition. His fleet dwarfed the Imperial defenders, massive battleships, strike cruisers, and trader transports spread out across the void, their hulls bristling with weapons of unimaginable power. Among them were the Titans of the Dark Mechanicum, war engines twisted by chaos, and demonic horrors lurking within the warp itself. At the heart of the fleet was the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, a fortress in its own right. Its bulk eclipsed the stars, casting a shadow over Terra as it descended into orbit, carrying the War Master and his traitor generals. The Sol system, once the beating heart of humanity's empire, had become the staging ground for the final battle. The siege of Terra had begun. Before the traitor forces could land on Terra, they first had to breach the Imperial defenses in the Sol system. Horus had meticulously planned his approach, using warp storms and psychic subterfuge to disrupt Imperial communications and sow confusion among the defenders. Entire outposts and space stations were wiped out before they could even raise the alarm. The outer defenses of the Sol system, including Pluto's orbital fortresses and the Jovian shipyards, fell swiftly. These once proud strongholds, manned by the best of the Imperial Navy, were overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the traitor assault. Admiral Ravniel Karen, commander of the Sol Defense Fleet, fought valiantly to slow Horus's advance, but he knew that the true battle would be fought on Terra itself. As Horus's fleet pushed deeper into the system, panic spread across Terra. The Imperial Palace, a sprawling complex of fortifications and cathedrals, became the focal point of the planet's defenses. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of the Emperor's power, and it had to hold. Rogel Dorn, Praetorian of Terra, had spent years fortifying the palace, turning it into a nigh impenetrable fortress. Every wall, gate, and tower had been reinforced, every corridor lined with defensive emplacements. But even Dorn, an unflinching warrior, knew that no fortress was truly unbreakable. When Horus's fleet finally reached Terra, the atmosphere boiled with fire as drop pods and assault landers descended through the skies. The traitor legions arrived in waves, each bringing their own brand of destruction to the battlefield. The once pristine skies of Terra were now choked with smoke and debris as warships clashed above and siege engines thundered below. The sons of Horus, Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's children made planetfall first, leading the assault on the palace's outer defenses. The Iron Warriors, led by Perturabo, unleashed their siege engines, pounding the palace walls with relentless artillery fire. The Night Lords, masters of terror, sowed chaos and fear among the defenders, their presence a constant reminder that there would be no mercy. Meanwhile, the Word-Bearers, led by Lorgar, erected dark monuments across the battlefield, summoning demonic entities to aid in the assault. The battle wasn't just one of steel and flesh. It was a war for the soul of humanity, fought in both the material realm and the warp. And at the heart of it all was Horus. The War Master watched from the vengeful spirit, directing his forces with cold precision. He knew that time was his enemy. The longer the siege dragged on, the more likely it was that loyalist reinforcements would arrive. He had to break the Imperial defenses quickly, or risk losing the momentum of his rebellion. Inside the palace walls, Rogel Dorn and his commanders prepared for the inevitable breach. The defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had one advantage: the Emperor's will. The Imperial defenders knew that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the very survival of humanity. Among the defenders was Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels. The angelic warrior had brought his legion to Terra, knowing that his fate was intertwined with the Emperor's. Sanguinius was more than just a warrior. He was a symbol of hope for the defenders, a shining beacon of nobility and sacrifice. But he was also plagued by visions of his own death, a dark premonition that hung over him like a shadow. As the battle raged on, the palace's outer walls began to crumble under the relentless assault of Perturabo's siege engines. The traitor legions pushed deeper into the palace grounds, their advance unstoppable. Entire sections of the palace were reduced to rubble, and the defenders were forced to fall back to the inner sanctums. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, the loyalists did not break. Sanguinius, his golden wings spread wide, led counter-assaults against the traitor forces, his sword flashing like lightning as he cut down scores of enemies. Rogel Dorn held the defensive lines, directing his forces with grim determination. The Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars fought with desperate fury, knowing that there could be no retreat. As the siege dragged on, the battle escalated to unprecedented levels of carnage. The traitor legions brought their titans to bear, massive war engines that shook the earth with every step. The Legio Mortis, corrupted by chaos, unleashed volcanic blasts of plasma and missile fire, tearing through the palace walls and reducing entire battalions to ash. The loyalist Titan legions, led by the Legio Ignatum, met them head-on, their massive war machines dueling across the shattered landscape. The ground itself became a cratered hellscape, littered with the bodies of the fallen and the wreckage of shattered Titans. In orbit, the naval battle continued to rage, with the Imperial Navy fighting to hold the traitor fleet at bay. But for every traitor ship destroyed, another seemed to emerge from the warp, carrying more reinforcements. The battle for Terra raged on, and despite the traitors' relentless assault, the loyalist forces still stood. Each warrior knew that the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Horus, however, was growing impatient. The War Master had been promised ultimate victory by the Chaos Gods, but every moment that Terra held out was a challenge to their will. The longer the siege dragged on, the more Horus's rage and frustration began to boil over. He wanted to end the war in one decisive blow. He wanted to face the Emperor himself and bring the Imperium to its knees. And so Horus made a fateful decision. He ordered the void shields of the vengeful spirit to be lowered. The void shields that protected the vengeful spirit were among the most formidable defenses in the galaxy. As long as they were active, no loyalist ship could hope to approach the flagship without being obliterated. But with the shields lowered, the vengeful spirit became vulnerable, an irresistible target for any Imperial strike force seeking to decapitate the traitor command. Horus knew exactly what he was doing. Horus wanted his father to come to him, to confront him directly aboard the vengeful spirit. He knew that only the Emperor could end the siege, and he wanted to face him on his own terms. The Emperor, watching from the palace, saw the shields drop and recognized the challenge. His mind, ancient and immeasurably powerful, could see the threads of fate converging. He knew that the moment had come. The battle would not be won through strategy or tactics. It would be won through a final confrontation between father and son. Accompanied by Sanguinius, Rogal Dorn, and a hand-picked group of loyalists, the Emperor boarded a Thunderhawk and prepared to launch the final assault on the vengeful spirit. The boarding party breached the hull of the vengeful spirit, entering a ship that was no longer a vessel of the Imperium. The once pristine corridors of the flagship had been twisted by the corrupting influence of chaos. The walls shifted and writhed, adorned with blasphemous symbols that seemed to whisper dark truths to those who looked too closely. The air was thick with the stench of decay and demonic presence, and shadows danced unnaturally in the flickering light. It wasn't just a ship anymore, it was a temple to the dark gods. Sanguinius took the lead, his golden armor gleaming even in the darkened corridors of the corrupted vessel. His powerful wings stretched wide as he moved forward with grace and determination. But there was a heaviness in his steps, a sense that he was walking toward his fate. The angel knew what awaited him. The angel had seen his death in visions long before the siege began. He had known that he would die at the hands of Horus, but he had never faltered. He wasn't fighting to save himself. He was fighting to save humanity. As the group moved deeper into the ship, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The warp energy suffusing the vengeful spirit pressed down on them like an invisible weight that threatened to crush their resolve. The loyalists fought their way through hordes of traitor marines and demons, but Sanguinius pressed on, his focus unwavering. Finally, they reached the bridge. Horus waited for them. When Sanguinius stepped onto the bridge of the vengeful spirit, he was greeted by a vision of horror. Horus stood at the center, clad in blackened armor adorned with the marks of chaos. His once proud features were now twisted by corruption, his eyes burning with malevolent power. He held Worldbreaker, his massive war mace, in one hand, a weapon that could shatter mountains with a single blow. Around him, demonic entities lurked in the shadows, their forms shifting and writhing as if the warp itself bled into reality. "Horus," Sanguinius said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Brother." Horus's gaze hardened, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition, a glimpse of the man he had once been. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold hatred. There was no room for reconciliation. Both knew that only one would leave the bridge alive. The duel between Sanguinius and Horus was short, brutal, and tragic. Sanguinius, despite his grace and speed, was outmatched. Horus had been empowered by the Chaos Gods, his strength and resilience far beyond what even a Primarch could withstand. Sanguinius fought with the fury of the Emperor's chosen, his blade striking with precision and skill. But each blow bounced off Horus's armor like raindrops on stone. Horus, by contrast, fought with unrelenting brutality. He wielded Worldbreaker with terrifying strength, each swing capable of crushing bone and shattering steel. The bridge of the vengeful spirit shook with the force of their clash, but it quickly became clear that Sanguinius was losing. Even in his final moments, Sanguinius refused to submit. Horus offered him one last chance to join him, to embrace the power of chaos and stand beside him as the rulers of humanity. But Sanguinius wouldn't betray his father, and then, with a single, devastating blow from Worldbreaker, Horus struck him down. The death of Sanguinius lingered in the air like a psychic wound, rippling through the warp and reverberating across Terra and beyond. The defenders of the Imperial Palace fought on, unaware that the fate of humanity had already shifted. It no longer hinged on the walls of the palace or the trenches filled with loyalist blood. The fate of the galaxy now rested aboard the vengeful spirit, where the Emperor himself had gone to face Horus Lupercal, his greatest triumph and his greatest failure. The Emperor of mankind, dressed in his golden armor, had boarded the corrupted flagship with Rogel Dorn and a contingent of his custodians, but he knew that this confrontation could not be shared. When they reached the threshold of the bridge, he turned to Dorn. "This is my burden," the Emperor said. His voice was calm, carrying the weight of countless millennia of sorrow and responsibility. "I must face him alone." Dorn clenched his fists, unwilling to let his father walk into what he knew was a trap, but he obeyed. He watched as the Emperor stepped into the heart of corruption, the bridge of the vengeful spirit, where Horus waited. The bridge of the vengeful spirit had become a throne room of chaos. The walls pulsed with sickly, organic life, twisted into grotesque shapes by warp energy. At the center of it was Horus and the lifeless body of Sanguinius. The War Master had been transformed beyond recognition. His Terminator armor, once a symbol of his leadership and nobility, was now a twisted amalgamation of flesh, metal, and demonic influence. His face, once proud and charismatic, was warped by hatred and corruption. His eyes burned with unholy light, and his voice carried the weight of the Chaos Gods who had claimed his soul. The clawed gauntlet that was stained with the blood of his brother Sanguinius, and Worldbreaker, his mighty war mace, rested in his hand. "Father," he said, his voice echoing with the malicious laughter of the gods, "you've finally come." The Emperor remained silent, his gaze never wavering. He was still hoping that Horus could be saved. And then, without warning, Horus struck. Worldbreaker came crashing down, aiming to shatter the Emperor's skull. The Emperor sidestepped, his golden armor shimmering in the dim light. Sparks flew as the mace tore through the bridge floor, sending shards of twisted metal scattering across the room. The Emperor retaliated with a psychic blast, a wave of pure energy that scorched the walls and sent lesser demons screaming into the void. But Horus was unfazed. He recovered quickly, advancing with terrifying confidence. The two clashed again, their blows shaking the ship to its core. Horus fought with brutal strength, each swing of Worldbreaker capable of reducing mountains to rubble. The Emperor countered with precision and psychic might, his strikes shattering the fabric of reality. The air around them crackled with raw energy, the warp bleeding into the material realm as father and son waged their final war. As they fought, Horus continued to taunt the Emperor, his words laced with venom. The Emperor remained silent, his focus unwavering, but Horus pressed on, his words cutting deep. The Emperor's hand faltered just for a moment, and in that moment, Horus struck. Worldbreaker smashed into the Emperor's chest, sending him crashing to the floor. The force of the blow cracked his armor, and blood spilled onto the corrupted floor. Horus loomed over him, his eyes burning with triumph. "You've already lost," Horus said again, his voice filled with contempt. "The gods have shown me the future. Your Imperium will crumble, and humanity will worship me." The Emperor lay wounded, but his spirit unbroken. For a moment, he looked up at Horus, the son he had loved most, now twisted beyond recognition. Then, something changed in the Emperor's expression. His eyes hardened. He rose to his feet, his golden armor tarnished. For too long, he had held back, refusing to use the full extent of his power. He had hoped to save his son, to redeem Horus, but now he knew that redemption was impossible. Horus was gone. The being before him was a vessel of pure chaos, a monster who had sacrificed everything in his pursuit of power. The Emperor finally unleashed his full psychic might, a devastating assault of pure, golden light that obliterated demons and tore through the fabric of reality. Horus screamed in defiance, but even he could not withstand the full wrath of the Emperor. The Emperor's final attack obliterated Horus's soul, erasing him from existence. It was a complete annihilation. Even the Chaos Gods could not resurrect Horus. His soul was gone forever, wiped from reality by the Emperor's psychic power. The Emperor stood over the lifeless body of his son, his golden armor cracked and bloodied. But he was dying. Horus had inflicted mortal wounds, wounds that even the Emperor's immense power could not heal. As the light of the Emperor's psychic assault faded, the bridge of the vengeful spirit fell silent. It was Rogel Dorn who found him. The Praetorian of Terra knelt beside his father, grief etched into his face. "My lord, Dorn's voice trembled. The Emperor, his voice weak but resolute, whispered his last words to Dorn. The battle for Terra had ended, but the war for the galaxy was far from over. The death of Horus Lupercal aboard the Vengeful Spirit sent a shockwave through the traitor legions. Their once unbreakable resolve crumbled. The arch-traitor, who had promised them victory and godhood, was dead, his soul obliterated by the Emperor's psychic might. Without their charismatic war master, the traitors fell into disarray, their cohesion shattered by the loss of their leader. As the forces of chaos retreated from Terra, the loyalist defenders stood victorious, though victory came at a terrible cost. Rogel Dorn and the remaining loyalists carried the shattered form of their emperor back to the Imperial Palace, where his destiny awaited him on the Golden Throne. The Golden Throne, the pinnacle of Imperial technology, had been designed by the Emperor himself as a gateway to the Webway, a secret project that, had it succeeded, would have allowed humanity to travel across the galaxy without reliance on the warp. But now, the throne's purpose had changed. The Emperor's body was beyond repair. No amount of gene crafting or cybernetic augmentation could heal the wounds inflicted by Horus. His psyche was shattered, his physical form broken, but his spirit endured. The Emperor's mind and soul still possessed immense power, and that power was needed to sustain the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed Imperial ships to navigate the warp. Without the Emperor, humanity would be lost, adrift in a galaxy dominated by chaos. Under Dorn's command, the tech priests of Mars and the remaining loyalist Primarchs began the grim task of entombing the Emperor on the Golden Throne. The process was fraught with tension and desperation, as every second counted. The Emperor's vital essence was slipping away, and if his mind failed, the light of the Astronomicon would be extinguished, plunging the Imperium into darkness. The scene was somber and heart-wrenching. The Primarchs, men who had once stood in awe of their father, now saw his broken form, a god reduced to a cripple. As the Emperor was connected to the Golden Throne, his mind reached out across the warp, anchoring the Astronomicon and keeping the darkness at bay. His body remained motionless, but his will endured. With Horus dead, the traitor legions quickly withdrew from Terra. Their leaders, the remaining traitor Primarchs, had no desire to continue the siege without Horus. The pact with the Chaos Gods had been broken. Horus was supposed to lead them to ultimate victory, but his failure had doomed the rebellion. The Death Guard, World Eaters, Emperor's children, and sons of Horus all fled into the warp, their fleets scattered and their morale shattered. The Iron Warriors, led by Perturabo, retreated to their fortress worlds, fortifying their defenses for the inevitable loyalist counterattack. Lorgar and his word-bearers vanished into the Eye of Terror, where they began to worship the Chaos Gods with renewed fervor, blaming humanity's weakness for their failure. But the sons of Horus, once the pride of the Imperium, were in complete disarray. With Horus dead, their identity was broken. Many of them abandoned their legion, becoming renegades and mercenaries, while others followed Abaddon, who would eventually rise to power as the next War Master. The loyalist forces, though battered and exhausted, knew that the war was not over. The traitors had fled, but they had not been destroyed. The Imperium could not allow them to regroup and rebuild, and so began the galactic campaign of retribution, led by the Loyalist legions to hunt down and destroy the traitors. The Imperial Fists, Ultramarines, Blood Angels, and Dark Angels spearheaded the scouring, chasing the traitor legions across the galaxy. World after world that had fallen to Horus's rebellion was reclaimed, and traitor strongholds were razed to the ground. The Loyalist Primarchs fought with righteous fury, determined to purge the galaxy of heresy. But the war was brutal, and the wounds of the Horus Heresy ran deep. As the scouring continued, the remaining Primarchs began to disappear. Some, like Robute Guilliman, were wounded in battle and placed in stasis. Others, like Lion L. Johnson, vanished into obscurity, leaving their legions to carry on without them. The Horus Heresy left the Imperium forever scarred. The dream of a unified humanity under reason and progress was shattered. In its place rose a regime of fear and fanaticism, clinging to the corpse of a god emperor to sustain itself. The Loyalist legions were broken down into smaller chapters to prevent any one leader from amassing too much power, as Horus had done. The Codex Astartes, penned by Robute Guilliman, became the blueprint for survival, governing the structure of the Adeptus Astartes for millennia to come. The Emperor's worship became state doctrine, while the Inquisition hunted heresy with merciless efficiency. The Imperium turned inward, suspicious of its own people, always vigilant for signs of rebellion or corruption. But despite the crushing bureaucracy, unrelenting war, and paranoia the Imperium endured, the legacy of the heresy was a galaxy condemned to eternal vigilance, forever fearful that another war master might rise, and that another betrayal might tear the Imperium apart.